Montana Territory, August 1870. For the wind swept low across the Bitterroot Valley, stirring dust over the cracked earth as Nolan Oakes stepped down from his saddle and stared at the burned-out remains of the homestead he had once called his whole world. His boots crunched through the ash. The barn was gone. The house was nothing but black bones. Nothing left but memories and silence. It had been 2 years since he buried Keira and their baby girl. Fever took them both before the thaw. Since then, Nolan had ridden farther than most men ever dreamed, chasing nothing, running from everything. He had not unpacked his saddlebags once. Grief had a way of clinging to a man like a second skin. Nolan wore it heavy, like the old trail coat still stained with ash from the night he lost everything. He had not meant to stop in the valley. His horse, Dust, had gone lame, and the nearest town was a half-day east. Nolan had spotted the small ranch house on a rise above the creek and thought maybe the folks there would take pity and offer a forge. What he had not expected was the woman. She came out of the barn with a rifle slung across her back, her skirts dusted from the corral, and sunlight catching the copper in her hair. She paused when she saw him, eyes narrowing. "You lost?" she asked, voice steady but not unkind. Nolan removed his hat. "Not exactly." Horse threw a shoe. "I was hoping someone here might have a forge." She studied him a long moment. "My brother left the forge behind when he went east. I can set the shoe if you do not mind waiting." "I do not mind." He tied Dust at the hitching post and followed her toward the barn. The place was small but kept fence-mended, stock healthy. There were chickens in the yard and a milk cow tethered in the shade. The woman moved like someone who had built her life with her own hands. She set the forge burning and turned to him. "Name's Keira Rowen." "Nolan Oakes," he replied, offering his hand. Her grip was firm. She went back to work without much talk, and he did not press her. He watched her instead, how she wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, how she hummed under her breath without realizing. "I can pay," he said as she hammered the shoe into place. "I do not need your money," Keira said, not looking up. "But I could use help splitting firewood if you are set on repaying a favor." He stayed.
Not just that day.
He split her wood, fixed a broken hinge on the chicken coop, and helped her drive in new fence posts. Each day bled into the next, and Nolan found himself waking before dawn without the weight that had once clung to his chest like iron. Keira did not ask about his past, and he did not ask about hers. Their silences were not heavy, they were comfortable. One morning, she brought him coffee on the porch. The sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline. "You do not talk much," she said. "I forgot how," he said softly. She tilted her head. "Seems to me you just need someone to listen." That was the first time he told her about Keira, about the little girl who never got to speak her first word. Keira sat beside him, quiet, her fingers curled around her mug. "I am sorry," she said after a long while. He nodded. "I thought the grief would last forever." She looked at him then, and there was something in her eyes he had not seen in a long time, gentleness wrapped in strength.
"You are still here," she said.
"That counts for something." That night, after supper, he offered to help her bring in wood from the stack. She reached for a bundle and brushed his hand by accident. Neither of them moved. The air was still. Nolan looked at her face, inches from his, and saw something he had not dared hope for. He leaned in just enough to give her the choice. Her breath hitched, but she did not pull away. Their first kiss was quiet and unhurried. It did not try to erase the past. It simply made room for something new. The next morning, Nolan found a reason to stay again. They rode out together to check on a neighbor's cattle that had wandered near the river. On the way back, Keira told him about her brother, how he had left 3 years ago and never written. She had not heard from him since. "I do not have much family left," she said. "You do now," Nolan said before he could think to stop himself. She glanced at him, something warm rising in her cheeks. "That's so." He nodded. If you want it. She did not answer straight away, but when they reached the porch, she took his hand and gave it a squeeze. That night, just before the lanterns went out, Nolan passed the room where she had set out a cot for him. He stood in the doorway, heart thudding. Keira stepped into the hall, barefoot, her hair braided over one shoulder. You do not have to sleep out here tonight. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. They did not speak again until morning. But when she woke with her head on his chest and his arms around her, she smiled like the sun had come up just for her. And for the first time in 2 years, Nolan Oakes believed in morning again. By late September, the air carried a faint chill in the mornings, and the aspens along the creek had begun to yellow. Nolan had taken to waking before Keira, lighting the hearth and setting coffee to boil while the eastern sky still held to its stars. He liked the quiet of that hour, the stillness before hoofbeats or hammer blows or the calls of her hens filled the day. He stood at the window now, watching mist curl above the pasture. Keira's mare moved through the grass, nose low. Inside, her footsteps crossed the floor behind him. She didn't speak, just came to stand beside him and leaned gently into his shoulder. I've been thinking about expanding the garden, she said, her voice still rough with sleep. He looked down at her. You'd need to clear brush past the shed. I can do that. I didn't say you couldn't. He let a small smile tug at the edge of his mouth. Just that it's thick out there. She nudged him with her elbow. You offering to lend a hand? He turned toward her fully. You planning to keep me around that long? She didn't answer right away, but her eyes held his, without hesitation. I was hoping you'd already decided to stay. He reached for her hand, callous like his, and gave it a soft squeeze. I'm not going anywhere. Later that week, they rode into town together. The trail followed the river east through cottonwoods, then turned north toward a cluster of buildings that passed for a main street. Keira needed flour and lamp oil, and Nolan had promised to help the blacksmith with an iron delivery. They tied their horses near the livery and walked side by side toward the mercantile. A few heads turned. Keira hadn't come to town with a man before, not since her brother left. Nolan noticed but said nothing. He figured folks could think what they liked. Inside, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Calder, peered over her spectacles. Miss Rowen. And Mr. Oakes, isn't it? Keira nodded. Need flour, 2 sacks. And oil. Do you still carry muslin? In the back, near the bolts of wool. She gave them the look Nolan couldn't quite read. Nice to see you out this way. As Keira walked toward the back shelves, Mrs. Calder leaned across the counter toward Nolan. She's done well, that girl, she said quietly. Held that place together when no one thought she could. Don't you go making her regret anything. Nolan lifted his chin slightly. I wouldn't. She studied him another moment, then rang up the sail with a curt nod. On the ride back, Keira balanced the sack of flour behind her saddle. She didn't mention the shopkeeper's words, but Nolan could tell something sat heavy on her mind. You ever think about leaving this valley? He asked.
Sometimes, she said.
But not because I want to. More because I wonder if I should've. When things got hard. You didn't. No, she looked straight ahead. I stayed. Maybe out of stubbornness. Maybe because I didn't know what else to do. That's not weakness. She was quiet for a long stretch of trail. Then, you ever think about starting over somewhere else? I tried, he admitted. Didn't take. Why not? Place doesn't matter if your heart's still buried back where you came from. She turned her head. And is it? He gave a slow shake of his head. Not anymore. That night, as they unloaded the sacks and set the oil by the pantry, Keira hesitated near the kitchen table. There's a letter, she said finally. Came last week. From Miles. Nolan didn't speak, just waited. He's in Missouri. Says he married a girl from St. Joseph. Wants to know if I'd sell the land. Says they could use the money. Nolan folded his arms, brows drawn. You thinking of it? She shook her head.
No. This is mine now.
I earned it every acre. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her waist. Then it stays yours. She leaned against him, her cheek against his shirt. I don't want to build anything I can't keep. You're not alone in it, Keira. You don't have to carry every weight by yourself. She looked up at him then, eyes soft but sure. I know. I just needed time to believe it. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, slow and certain. And out the window, the last light of the day slipped behind the hills, but neither of them noticed. They had already begun carving something new from the pieces of all they had lost. October came in slow and gold, with frost skimming the mornings and the scent of wood smoke steeping into everything. Nolan was mending the south fence when Keira rode out with a wrapped parcel tied to her saddle. She reined in beside him, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I'm heading to the Meachams, she said. Their youngest turned 5. I made a quilt for him. Nolan leaned on the post he'd just set. You want me to ride with you? They've only got the 1-mule cart. Wouldn't be right to crowd them when they're already feeding kin down from Lewistown. I'll be back before dusk. He handed her the reins she'd dropped. Watch the low crossing. River's higher than last week. I will, she said. There's stew warming on the stove if you get hungry. He watched her until she disappeared behind a stand of pine, then turned back to the fence, driving each nail with steady precision. By mid-afternoon, a pale wind picked up from the north. He cinched his coat tighter and kept working until the sun slipped westward and shadows stretched long over the pasture. Keira didn't return by dusk. Nolan left the fence tools where they lay and saddled his mare with practiced hands. The trail to the Meachams was narrow and rocky in places, and with the light going, he kept the horse at a careful pace. He passed the low crossing she'd warned of still passable, but slick with moss and runoff. The chill deepened as he rode. He reached the Meachams near nightfall. Their windows glowed warm, and voices drifted from inside. Nolan dismounted and rapped on the door. A tall woman with a thick braid answered. Evenin', she said. You lost. I was looking for Keira Rowen, Nolan said. She was riding out here this morning. The woman frowned. She never came. Nolan's gut tightened. You sure? I been here since daybreak. She didn't pass this way. He nodded once and turned back to his horse. The woman called after him, but he was already in the saddle, riding hard. He checked the fork in the trail, where the left cut toward the Meachams and the right veered toward the bluffs. Loose gravel showed signs of a slide, hoofprints scattered, then vanished into churned earth. He followed them down the slope, reins tight, his breath sharp in his throat. He found her just past the ridge, crouched near fallen cedar. Her mare grazed nearby, reins dragging. Keira's skirt was torn up the side, and one sleeve hung loose at the shoulder. She looked up when he called her name. You hurt? He asked, dropping beside her. Not bad, she said. Got thrown. The trail gave out under us. He checked her arm. It was scraped raw, but not broken. She winced when he pressed gently along her ribs, but nodded when he stopped. Bruised, she said. That's all. He took his coat off and eased it over her shoulders. You should have waited for me to ride with you. I didn't think I needed help. You don't, but I want to be there anyway. She studied him in the dim light, her jaw working like she was trying to decide what to say. I never had anyone come looking for me, she said finally. Not once. You do now. She leaned her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close while the wind rustled the grass around them. The stars blinked out overhead, cold and bright. They rode back slowly. He kept one arm around her waist, steadying her in the saddle. Back at the ranch, he helped her down and guided her inside. She didn't protest when he unwrapped the ruined sleeve and washed the grit from her cuts. You'll be sore in the morning, he said. I'll live, she answered, her voice soft. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the quilt up around her shoulders. Nolan stood near the stove, watching the stew warm. Clara was never afraid of storms, he said after a long silence. But she hated being alone in them. Keira looked up. You miss her? I always will. But I'm not carrying her grief anymore. That's the difference. She reached for his hand. You're not the only one who lost someone. He nodded. I know. They sat like that, fire crackling, steam rising from the pot behind him. No more words passed between them, but something settled between their joined hands, something quiet and sure. Outside, the first snow began to fall, dusting the porch and the fields beyond, and they stayed where they were, together in the warmth they'd made. By mid-November, the ground had hardened underfoot, and the days shortened enough that supper was lit by lantern most evenings. The woodpile had shrunk, the animals thickened their coats, and Kira's breath lingered long in the air when she stepped out each morning to scatter feed. Nolan had taken to carving in the evenings, his hands always needing work. He sat at the table smoothing down a length of pine, shaving it into the beginnings of a yoke for the wagon Keira hoped to use come spring. She was sewing by the hearth, the firelight catching the fine thread of her needle as it passed through the fabric. I saw a man in town last week, Nolan said after a long spell of quiet. Hiram Tully. He used to ride with me, back before I came west. Keira looked up from the quilt square. You didn't mention you knew anyone out this way. I didn't know he'd come this far either. Thought he'd stayed in Kansas, or maybe crossed into Indian Territory. We worked cattle together, then drifted apart when the war ended and things got mean. She set the project in her lap. He bring trouble? Not yet. But he asked questions. Said he'd heard I was out here. Asked if I still carried a sidearm. Do you? He tapped the knife's spine against the wood, slow and even. I keep it where I can reach it, but I haven't drawn it for a man in years. Keira nodded once, then bent back to her stitching. Later, while they cleared the table, she reached for a tin box Nolan hadn't seen before. She opened it carefully, revealing a worn stack of paper, folded and creased. They're letters, she said. From my mother. She died before Miles and I came west. I kept these through everything, even when we nearly starved that first winter. Nolan looked down at the topmost one, its ink faded and edges softened like cloth. Why show me now? Because I want you to know who I come from. She wrote about planting by the moon, about the way my father laughed with his whole chest. She wrote like she believed everything could be stitched back together if you just kept your hands moving. He touched one corner of the paper. Sounds like someone I would have liked. She'd have liked you, Keira said. She'd have liked that you don't talk for the sake of hearing your own voice. That night, Nolan lay awake beside her, listening to the wind push against the shutters. Kira's breathing was steady, her hand resting lightly on his chest. He turned his head and watched the way her hair spilled across the pillow, the firelight turning it nearly bronze. You ever think about what comes next? He asked quietly. She didn't open her eyes. You mean after the fence is mended and the winter wood stacked? I mean after that. Us. What we're building. Her fingers moved, just once, against the fabric of his shirt. I think about a small wedding in spring. I think about a garden full of beans and squash and maybe a boy with your eyes. He swallowed around the sudden catch in his throat. I'd like that. Outside, the wind eased, and snow began to fall in soft flurries. Nolan closed his eyes, his arm tightening around her. In the stillness, he realized he'd stopped waiting for the ache to return. It hadn't come in days. Before dawn, he rose and stepped out to the barn. The cold bit through his shirt, but his breath came easy. Inside, he ran his hand along the mare's neck, then checked the calf that had limped through a bad hoof. Everything was quiet, whole. When he returned to the house, Keira was awake, wrapping her shawl tight as she poured coffee. She turned when he came in, and her expression eased in a way that made his chest feel like it had been stretched open, filled with something warm and alive. "I thought I lost everything," Nolan said, voice low. "But I didn't know something better was waiting." Keira stepped into his arms, her forehead resting against his. "You didn't find me by accident." "I know." She laced her fingers through his. "We'll be all right, won't we?" He kissed her knuckles one by one. "We already are." And outside, as morning broke pale and clean over the Bitterroot Valley, the snow kept falling, soft as a promise. The sun held low in the sky well past morning, throwing long fingers of light over the frost-hardened pasture. Nolan stood at the edge of the corral, one gloved hand resting on the top rail. Keira was inside, drying apples by the stove for winter, and he'd stepped out to clear his head. The air smelled of cold soil and distant pine, and the quiet pressed in, not heavy but watchful. A wagon creaked up the trail, wheels crunching the ground's frozen crust. Nolan turned as it came into view. A man sat atop the bench, reins loose in his hands, a battered bowler, hat pulled low. Nolan recognized Hiram Tully before the man raised a hand in greeting. "Didn't mean to drop in unannounced," Hiram said, drawing the team to a stop. "Heard you were set up here." Nolan didn't move from the rail. "You looking for work?" "Not exactly." Keira opened the door of the house, drying cloth still in hand. Her brows knit as she stepped onto the porch. "I told her about you," Nolan said, voice even. Hiram nodded toward Keira.
"Mom."
She dipped her head once, then stepped back inside without a word. "I ain't here to stir anything up," Hiram said. "Just came to settle something." Nolan crossed to him, boots crunching over the stiff grass. "Go on." "I've been carrying something," Hiram said, lowering his voice. "Back in Kansas, year after the war, we rode with a man named Redden. You recall what happened outside Topeka?" "I recall." "Well, I didn't tell it straight when the sheriff asked. Said you fired first." "That ain't true." Nolan's jaw tightened. "Why come clean now?" "Because I got a boy of my own now. And I don't want him growing up thinking I made my life off lies." Nolan stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You're not welcome to stay." "I figured." Hiram reached into his coat, pulled free a folded slip of paper and held it out. "Signed statement. Says I lied." Nolan didn't take it. "Keep it," Hiram said. "Or burn it. But I'm telling it straight now." He turned the team and drove off, wagon rattling down the trail until it disappeared behind the rise. Nolan walked back toward the house. Keira stood just inside the door, arms folded. "You sure he's gone for good?" she asked. "He didn't bring trouble this time." She stepped aside so he could come in. The scent of drying fruit filled the room, and the fire laid soft shadows across the walls. "You going to tell the sheriff?" "No point," Nolan said. "That part of my life's finished." She studied him a moment, then reached out and touched the brim of his coat sleeve. "You look different." He raised an eyebrow. "How's that?" "Lighter." He glanced toward the window, where the light had shifted to gold. "Feels that way." By December, the days passed in a rhythm that felt almost like music. Nolan built a henhouse behind the barn and hung a bell over the porch so Keira could call him in from the field. They spent evenings sorting seed catalogs sent up from Helena, planning rows and furrows, and where to place a new line of berry bushes. One morning, Keira came in from feeding the cow, cheeks flushed from the cold, and set a woven pouch on the table.
"Mended this," she said.
"Figured you could carry tools in it." Nolan opened it, running his hand over the tight stitching. "You did this by hand?" "I do most things by hand." He crossed the room and kissed the side of her neck, just below her ear. "You do everything better than anyone I've known." She turned, her voice quiet. "Would you marry me here? On the land?" He nodded. "Anywhere you ask." The wedding came in early March, after the thaw, but before the wildflowers. They stood beneath the cottonwood by the creek, the same place Nolan had first seen her coming out of the barn. Keira wore a dress the color of faded cream, her hair combed back with a silver pin Nolan had found in town weeks before. The preacher from the settlement 6 miles north read from a pocket Bible, voice barely rising above the breeze. When he finished, Keira reached out and took Nolan's hand in both of hers. "You are my home," she said, "and I will keep you, all the days I'm given." Nolan didn't speak right away. He looked at her, really looked, the way a man might look at the first clear sky after a long, hard storm. "I've been lost more years than I care to count," he said. "But you found me, and I will never let go." They kissed, slow and sure, and the small gathering of neighbors clapped and laughed, though it was quiet laughter, the kind that comes from respect more than show. Spring came, and with it, the first shoots of green through the thawed ground. Keira planted rows of carrots and onions, while Nolan built a new pen for the sheep a neighbor had given them as a wedding gift. They cleaned out the loft above the barn, made space for storage, and hung a lantern under the eaves. One evening, Nolan came in with a splinter in his thumb and sat while Keira worked it out with a needle. "You ever think of naming this place?" she asked, dabbing the skin with a clean cloth. "Never gave it much thought." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was thinking we could call it Twin Cedars, for those 2 trees that stand right outside the gate." He smiled, the kind that warmed slow and deep. "Then Twin Cedars it is." Years passed, and they wore into each other like river stone. Nolan's hair grayed at the temples. Keira's hands thickened from years of work, but her eyes stayed bright. They built a second room onto the house, then a small shed for drying herbs. When their son came, they named him Elias, after Keira's father. He grew strong and curious, with Nolan's quiet and Keira's fire. He followed his mother through the rows of beans and watched his father shape wood with careful hands. They grew old in the valley side by side. And when the wind stirred the grass and the creek sang low through spring thaw, Nolan would still pause, hand against the rail, and remember the first time he saw her rifle on her back, hair catching the sun, and know, deep in his bones, that he had found exactly where he belonged. And he never wandered again.